The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of a bustling city. But for Emily Thompson, the world had narrowed down to the small wooden easel in front of her. At only 12 years old, she had already endured more hardship than most adults ever would. Diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a rare and aggressive form of blood cancer, she had spent the past 2 years in and out of hospitals, her small body a battleground for relentless chemotherapy and painful procedures. The treatments drained her, leaving her limbs weak, her once lush golden hair now a faint memory, replaced by a scalp covered in soft, delicate fuzz. But her spirit remained unbroken. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for a dream. Art had always been Emily's sanctuary, a place where the pain, the fear, and the uncertainty couldn't reach her. When she held a paintbrush, she wasn't a sick child hooked up to 4 drips. She was an artist, a creator of worlds that existed beyond hospital walls. Her mother, Claire Thompson, had always encouraged her creativity, scraping together what little extra money they had to buy her paints and canvases, even when it meant skipping meals or taking on extra shifts at the diner where she worked. But now, painting wasn't just a passion. It was a necessity. The medical bills had piled up to an insurmountable level, drowning Claire in debt that she could never hope to repay on a waitress's salary. The treatments Emily needed were getting costlier, and though Claire worked herself to exhaustion, she still wasn't earning enough to cover the next round of chemotherapy. Desperate and unwilling to watch her mother suffer under the crushing weight of their situation, Emily had made a decision. She would sell her paintings. She knew it wasn't much, but she had to try. And so, on that cool Saturday afternoon, Emily set up her makeshift stall just outside Buckingham Palace, a place where thousands of tourists flocked daily. She had heard stories of street performers and artists making a living in busy areas, and in her innocent optimism, she had convinced herself that surely someone, somewhere, would stop and buy her work. But reality was harsher than her imagination. For hours, she sat there, her frail body bundled up in an oversized coat, watching the crowds walk past her without a second glance. Some paused briefly, their eyes scanning over her collection of paintings, each one meticulously crafted with colors that seemed to burst from the canvas, before offering her nothing more than a polite nod and moving along. Others barely even acknowledged her presence, their attention fixated on the grandeur of the palace behind her rather than the little girl selling art in its shadow. Her hands, wrapped in thin gloves, trembled slightly as she reached for a half-finished painting beside her. It was a portrait she had been working on, a depiction of a royal guard, standing tall and unwavering beneath a stormy sky. Something about them fascinated her, their silent strength, their unshakable composure. They reminded her of herself, in a way, standing firm even when the storm raged around them. A sigh escaped her lips as she dipped her brush into a pool of deep blue, adding subtle strokes to the swirling sky in the background. The paint was running low, and she knew she wouldn't be able to afford more if she didn't sell at least one painting soon. Her mother, standing beside her with an encouraging smile, tried to remain hopeful. "We just need one person, sweetheart," Claire said, rubbing her daughter's shoulders gently. "One person who sees how special your art is." Emily nodded, forcing herself to believe it, but deep down, doubt was creeping in. Minutes stretched into hours, and still no one had stopped. The ache in her legs from sitting for so long, the cold creeping into her bones, the whispers of passers-by who threw her pitying glances but no money. It all made her feel invisible. Was this what it was like to be forgotten? Just as she was about to pack up, the sound of boots clicking against stone caught her attention. A tall figure in a striking red uniform and a bearskin hat was approaching, one of the royal guards, his presence commanding yet composed. Unlike the crowds who had ignored her, he stopped in front of her table, his piercing blue eyes scanning over the paintings with an unreadable expression. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding. Was he going to ask her to leave? The guard reached out, his gloved fingers grazing the edge of the painting she had been working on. His gaze softened, just a fraction, but enough for Emily to notice. "This," he finally spoke, his voice steady but kind, "is quite extraordinary." Emily's throat tightened. No one had spoken to her like that all day. Not as a sick child or an object of pity, but as an artist. "To thank you," she stammered. He studied the painting in silence, then glanced down at her, his brows furrowing slightly. "Did you paint all of these?" She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I did. I'm selling them to help pay for my chemotherapy." Claire tensed beside her, as though fearful that admitting their struggle would bring them shame, but Emily didn't regret saying it. It was the truth. For a long moment, the guard said nothing. His fingers traced the edges of the canvas, his gaze lingering on the strokes of color, the emotion Emily had poured into every inch. Then, with a deliberate and unexpected motion, he straightened and removed his wallet from his coat. "I'll take this one," he said, pulling out a crisp 50 pounds note. Far more than Emily had ever expected to receive for a single painting. Her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "Are you sure?" she whispered. The guard smiled, not the stiff, rehearsed smile of someone offering charity, but a genuine one, filled with something she hadn't seen in anyone else that day. "Absolutely." Claire covered her mouth, eyes glistening with unshed tears, as she watched her daughter exchange the painting for the money. But what happened next stunned them all. The guard didn't leave. Instead, he turned to face the gathering crowd, tourists and locals alike who had slowed to watch the unusual interaction. He lifted the painting up for them to see, his voice steady and commanding. "This young girl is selling her art for a cause greater than any of us," he announced. "And I can tell you this. Her work is worth far more than what she's asking for." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, eyes shifting from the guard to Emily, to the beautiful paintings they had all ignored moments ago. "She's talented," the guard continued, "and she deserves to be seen." Something shifted then, like a wave breaking through the indifference that had kept people moving past her all day. One by one, people stepped forward, not just to admire her work, but to buy it. A woman in a designer coat pulled out a 20-pound note. A man in a business suit handed over 100 pounds. Another family, 2 children clutching their parents' hands, chose a painting of a sunset over the Thames, leaving double the asking price behind. Within minutes, every single one of Emily's paintings had been sold. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she clutched the money in her hands, looking up at the guard, who simply nodded before stepping back into position. He had done his duty, not just as a sentinel of the palace, but as a protector of hope. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt something stronger than fear, stronger than pain. She felt seen. The weight of the crisp pound notes in Emily's trembling hands was almost surreal. She stared at them, blinking through the tears that threatened to spill over, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her mother, Claire, was sobbing silently beside her, her shoulders shaking with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Just moments ago, they had been invisible, overlooked, cast aside by a world too busy to care. But now people were looking at her, seeing her for the first time, not as a sick child in need of sympathy, but as an artist, as a person with something valuable to offer. And at the heart of it all stood the royal guard who had changed everything. Emily wiped her eyes and turned to look at him again. His uniform, immaculate red tunic, polished buttons, gleaming black boots, was a very image of discipline and duty. His tall bearskin hat cast a shadow over his face, but those piercing blue eyes were locked onto hers with something she couldn't quite define. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the dispersing crowd. The guard simply inclined his head, his expression unreadable once more. But before Emily could say anything else, the distinct clop-clop of another pair of boots echoed across the stone pavement. Another royal guard, slightly older and more rigid in posture, approached, his expression stern. "Private Harris, return to your post." The guard, Harris, hesitated for only a fraction of a second before giving a sharp nod. Without another word, he stepped back into formation, his body once again taking on the statue-like composure that all royal guards were trained to maintain. The moment passed, and just like that, it was as if nothing had happened. The tourists resumed their chattering. The London wind carried away the murmurs and life moved on. But for Emily, nothing would ever be the same. She clutched the money tightly, her mind racing with possibilities. This was more than she had ever dared to hope for. It wouldn't cover everything, not even close, but it was a start. It was hope, something she hadn't felt in far too long. Her mother wrapped an arm around her, squeezing gently. "Come on, sweetheart," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Let's get you home." The next day, an unexpected visit. The morning sunlight filtered through the small apartment window, casting a warm glow on the makeshift art studio Emily had created in the corner of their living room. The walls were adorned with her paintings, bright, vivid landscapes, portraits filled with life, colors that seemed to burst from the canvas despite the heaviness of their reality. Claire was in the kitchen, brewing instant coffee, her expression lighter than it had been in months. "We'll go to the hospital today," she said, stirring the coffee absent-mindedly. "Pay for at least part of the next round. We can figure the rest out later." Emily nodded, staring at the blank canvas before her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't painting to escape. She was painting with purpose. A sharp knock at the door pulled them both from their thoughts. Claire exchanged a puzzled glance with Emily before wiping her hands on a dish towel and hurrying to the door. When she pulled it open, her eyes widened in shock. Standing there, looking out of place yet composed as ever, was Private Harris, the royal guard from the palace. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but firm. Claire's mouth opened and closed, as if she wasn't quite sure how to process this. "Hello." Emily jumped up from her seat, eyes wide. You're the guard from yesterday." A small smile ghosted the corners of his lips. "I am," he confirmed. "May I come in?" Claire hesitated for only a second before stepping aside, allowing him to enter their modest apartment. It was a stark contrast to the grand palace. He stood outside every day, small, cozy, but undeniably filled with warmth and love. He took in the surroundings, his eyes flickering over the paintings before settling back on Emily. "I wanted to check on you," he said simply. Emily's heart swelled with something she couldn't quite describe. No one, not the doctors, not the people who had walked by her stall, not even some of the nurses at the hospital, had ever followed up with her like this. "I'm okay," she said quickly, though the truth was more complicated. Harris gave a slow nod. "Good." He paused, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather envelope. "I also wanted to give you this." Emily took the envelope hesitantly, exchanging a look with her mother before carefully opening it. As soon as she saw what was inside, she gasped. A bank check for £10,000. Claire nearly collapsed. "What?" She stumbled over her words, eyes darting between the check and the guard. I don't understand. Why would you?" Harris exhaled, his usually unreadable expression softening just a bit. "Because you need it," he said simply. "And because I know what it's like to watch someone you love fight for their life." Silence filled the small room. Emily's fingers clutched the check, her hands shaking. But how?" Harris hesitated for the first time, his jaw tightening slightly. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he answered, "Because I had a sister who fought the same battle." Emily's breath caught. "She was just a few years older than you," he continued, his blue eyes clouded with memory. "She loved to paint too. She used to say that colors made her feel alive even when everything else tried to take that feeling away." He paused, as if trying to push past something heavy. "She didn't make it." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, her own eyes misting. "I'm so sorry." Harris only nodded. "I couldn't do anything to save her. But maybe I can help you." Emily stared at him. This man who had started as nothing more than a silent figure in a grand uniform, now standing before her, offering something far more valuable than just money. A chance. A chance to fight. A chance to live. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she clutched the check against her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, voice trembling with raw emotion. I don't even know how to say how much this means." "You don't have to," he said softly. "Just promise me one thing." She sniffled, nodding. "Anything? Keep painting." Emily let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, despite the tears still falling. "I promise." Harris gave her one last nod before stepping back toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Claire found her voice again. "Wait," she said. "How can we ever repay you?" The guard paused, his lips curving into the faintest smile before he answered. "By getting better." And with that, he stepped outside and disappeared into the London morning. But his presence, his kindness, his miracle, that would never leave. The £10,000 sat in Emily's mother's hands, the weight of it as surreal as the moment itself. It wasn't just money, it was time. Time to fight, time to hope, time to live. Claire had spent countless sleepless nights staring at overdue bills, running numbers in her head, trying to find solutions in a world that seemed determined to push them toward defeat. But now, standing in their small apartment with a check that felt almost too good to be real, she dared to believe that things might finally change. Emily, still clutching the envelope, sat back down at her easel, her mind spinning. Private Harris had vanished as swiftly as he had appeared, but his impact lingered, etched into their lives like brushstrokes on a canvas. She had made a promise to keep painting, and she intended to keep it. A month later, a surprise visitor and an unexpected invitation. The chemotherapy had taken its toll again, leaving Emily weaker than before, but her spirit remained unshaken. The treatments had restarted, the hospital visits had resumed, but this time there was something different: hope. The money from Harris had allowed them to breathe, to pay for the essential treatments without the crippling weight of financial despair suffocating them. Despite everything, Emily kept painting. She painted through the nausea, through the fatigue, through the long, sleepless nights in the hospital, where the beeping of machines formed an unwelcome lullaby. Her hands had grown thinner, her skin paler, but her paintings had never been more vivid. Her story, the girl selling paintings for her chemo, the royal guard who had changed her fate, had started spreading beyond the palace gates. First, it was whispers in the local community. Then, a blogger picked up the story. And before they even had time to process what was happening, a news reporter came knocking on their door. It was a whirlwind. People wanted to meet her. Art lovers, philanthropists, even strangers from across the world who had read about her story wanted to help. Donations began trickling in, not just money, but supplies. High-quality paints, professional-grade brushes, pristine canvases. All things she had once dreamed of but never imagined she'd actually own. Then the letter arrived. A formal invitation, embossed in gold. Buckingham Palace. An art exhibit. Her art exhibit. Claire read the words aloud twice, her voice trembling with disbelief. The palace had arranged for a showcase of Emily's work, featuring her paintings in one of their exhibition halls. The letter stated that members of the royal family had taken notice of her story and wanted to offer her a platform, not just as a sick child, but as a true artist. Emily could barely breathe. She was going to display her art inside the palace. The grand exhibition, a night to remember. The evening was a dream, one Emily feared she might wake up from at any moment. The grand hall shimmered under chandeliers, the polished floors reflecting the glow of soft golden lights. Along the walls, her paintings hung in perfect alignment, framed elegantly, each one a testament to her journey, her battles, her soul. Guests arrived in flowing gowns and tailored suits, murmuring in admiration as they took in the pieces. Some knew her story. Others had come purely for the art. But it didn't matter. They were seeing her. They were seeing her work. She stood beside Claire, her small hands gripping the edge of her dress nervously. The excitement coursed through her veins, But so did the uncertainty. Would they really understand? Would they truly appreciate what she had poured into each piece? Then, the familiar click of polished boots reached her ears. Emily turned just as Private Harris stepped into the hall. This time, he wasn't in uniform. He wore a simple, well-fitted suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression softer than before. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, still held that quiet strength that had first caught her attention. "You came," she whispered. Harris stopped in front of her, looking around at the paintings before letting his gaze settle on hers. "I wouldn't miss it," he said simply. Before she could say another word, a sudden hush fell over the room. The crowd parted slightly, and Emily's heart nearly stopped as she saw who had entered. The Prince and Princess of Wales. Claire squeezed Emily's hand so hard she thought her fingers might break. The royal couple approached with the grace and warmth of people who understood the weight of their presence. The princess, elegant and poised, knelt slightly to meet Emily's gaze. Her eyes filled with genuine kindness. "Your paintings are extraordinary," she said softly. "Each one tells a story. Your story." Emily, frozen in awe, could barely speak. "Thank you, Your Highness." The prince stepped forward, admiring the piece that Emily had painted of Harris standing under the stormy sky. "This one," he murmured. "It's powerful." Emily swallowed. "It's about strength," she said, stealing a glance at Harris. "Standing tall even when everything around you is falling apart." The prince exchanged a knowing look with Harris before nodding approvingly. "You have a gift, Emily." The princess smiled. "And we'd like to help you share it with the world." She gestured, and one of the royal attendants stepped forward, holding yet another envelope. Claire's breath hitched as she took it, her hands shaking as she opened it. Emily didn't understand at first, until she saw the words printed inside. A full scholarship to the Royal Academy of Arts. For a long moment, she could do nothing but stare. Then, the emotions hit like a tidal wave. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they weren't from sadness or fear. They were from something far greater. Relief, joy, hope. She turned to Harris, her heart bursting with gratitude, but the look on his face said he already knew. "I told you," he said with the faintest smirk. "Keep painting," and she would, because for the first time in a long time, Emily saw a future, one where she wasn't just a girl fighting cancer. She was an artist, and the world was finally ready to see her.